Job chapter 3, please. Job chapter 3 on page 337. After today, we'll only have 10 lessons left, so 2.5 months. Today, the title of today's lesson is, If Only I'd Never Been Born. If Only I'd Never Been Born. Reminder for what I've deemed as the overarching theme within Job is that the overarching theme in the book of Job is that of the back and forth nature of humanity, specifically those who believe in God, as it relates to the goodness of the divine and the difficulties faced in suffering. Now, I don't think I announced it, but my working title for the series through Job is The Goodness of the Divine. That's part of what is being taught throughout Job, is the goodness of the divine. And so today, we'll pick up there in chapter 3 and go through the whole thing. And we'll witness Job's first words, if you will. He said a few things, but his first specific amount of words, I should say, having endured the most unimaginable suffering. And this chapter marks the beginning of a profound exploration of human suffering and the search for meaning and pain, the struggle with despair, as it relates to the reality that there is a God out there and we still have difficulties and despair on this earth. Today's passage is divided into 3 sections. First, we're going to analyze Job's curse of his birth, then the lament over his existence, and then finally his questioning of the purpose of life and suffering. Now, up to this point, Job has lost his children, he's lost his wealth, he's lost his health now, and without really saying much, the only 2 statements that he's made is the first one, in which he appeared to note that his death was soon to come, and then he falls down and worships God as a recognition of the astronomical blessings God had given him. The second statement, or the second response that he gave, was in response to his wife saying, well, why don't you just give up your integrity, curse God, and die already? And there he recognizes that's a foolish statement. In following, he said, shall we receive good at the hand of God, or shall we not receive evil? Again, not that he was saying the evil came from God. John explains that in God is no darkness at all. James says no one can tempt God, no one can say they are tempted by God, because God does not tempt anyone. The writer of Psalm 92 says, in God is no unrighteousness. Thus, as I explained that last week, it's foolish to think that because we serve God and we've received blessings, we've received good from God, that evil then cannot affect us. In fact, I stated that it might be better to consider that because we serve God and because we've received good and blessings from God, evil will actually be fighting desperately to afflict us in those circumstances. Which opens up a unique question. Well, what if we don't receive good from God? What if we don't receive blessings from God? What then? We'll discover that later. As we closed chapter 2, Job's 3 friends arrived, and sat in mourning with Job for 7 days and 7 nights. I find that interesting, the 7 days and 7 nights thing, because this is not a Jewish person. He's someone outside of the Jewish realm, and technically, if we believe it happened during the time of the patriarchs, the Jewish nation, the Israelite nation, had not yet been established. But what do we see the Jewish people doing when someone dies? They sit Shiva for 7 days, 7 nights. I found that interesting that Job and his friends did this 7 days, 7 nights, and then that practice is still today. I don't know if that's any correlation there, but I thought it was interesting. So with that in mind, we'll pick up in chapter 3, and we're going to read verses 1 down through verse 10. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed his day. And Job spake and said, let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night in which it was said, there is a man-child conceived. Let that day be darkness, let not God regard it from above, neither let the light shine upon it. Let darkness and the shadow of death stain it, let a cloud dwell upon it, let the blackness of the day terrify it. As for that night, let darkness seize upon it. Let it not be joined unto the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. Lo, let that night be solitary. Let no joyful voice come therein. Let them curse it that curse the day, who are ready to raise up their mourning. Let the stars of the twilight thereof be dark. Let it look for light, but have none. Neither let it see the dawning of the day, because it shut up not the doors of my mother's womb, nor hid sorrow from mine eyes. And so, number one, we'll look at a curse for the day of his birth. A curse for the day of his birth. David Guzik said that this opening chapter, or this chapter 3, really, begins the battle in Job's mind and soul. He will not lose more or suffer more than he already has, though his physical pain is going to continue. Yet now we can say that the battle enters an entirely other arena. The arena of Job's mind and soul. How will he choose to think about his suffering? How will he choose to think about what others think about his suffering? How will he choose to think about God in all this? These are the questions that take up the remainder of the book, and soon to come to any person that suffers in this life. The catastrophic loss itself is only an entry point into the agonizing battle of mind and soul. As a note, there is well, we don't see it, but there's a distinct language change beginning in chapter 3, verse 3. So the previous style was kind of a narrative, historical style, telling you, this is what happened historically. Well, the change in this, which is why most believe potentially Job is the one that wrote it down, because of the way he speaks in here, or because of the language change, but it shifts to a first-person poetic style as opposed to a narrative historical style. And thus, because of that change, as with most poetic things, there are figures of speech, there are exaggerations, there's differences that we don't necessarily have to take as literal as we might take other things. So we would take the information provided to us previously as very literal, because that's how it's designated. Here we have a little bit of leeway to determine whether or not it is literal, or whether it's simply a figure of speech, or whether he's just exaggerating something here and there. Obviously, we're going to be careful not to get carried away with doing those things, as some do, but it is there because it is poetic. And I should say, just because something is poetic doesn't mean it's necessarily not true. A lot of people have tried to use that as a cop-out to, oh, well, it's poetic, therefore it can't be true. That's not necessarily the case. In these verses before us, verses 1 through 10, Job expresses the wish that the day of his birth would be obliterated from the calendar. Even if it was possible, the day in which he was conceived, that his parents conceived him, he wants that to be a day of darkness, devoid of light, no joy. This desire for darkness symbolizes Job's inner turmoil and the overwhelming sense of hopelessness that has now engulfed him. His longing for darkness can be understood as a metaphor for his desires to return to a state of non-existence, where he would have been better off because he would not have had to endure pain. He would not have had to endure this suffering that now defines his life. And so he continues to curse the day by calling it to be filled with gloom and darkness and terror. He wishes no joy to come from that day, rather a night of barrenness. The imagery of darkness and the barrenness underscores Job's profound sense of desolation. He feels as though his life, which was once full of light, which was once full of joy, it's now been plunged into an unending darkness. His curse reflects a deep desire to undo his very existence, to erase the moment when his life had began. In verse 8, Job calls on those who curse days to curse his birthday. Likely what we believe he means by that, those who curse days, those who pronounce curses would be sorcerers or those who practice witchcraft of some sort. And it's not that he was approving that system, or not that he was approving that practice, but if it was possible for them to curse that day, he wants them to curse that day. At the end of verse 8, we have a tricky phrase, who are ready to raise up their mourning. Now, the word mourning, it's elsewise translated when we come to chapter 41 as Leviathan. So it's kind of a confusing spot there, but we'll discuss more about the Leviathan later on. But for now, let's suppose the historical sources are correct in promoting that Leviathan is a sea monster of some sort, a dragon that lived in the sea that terrorized sailors. So those that are ready to raise up their mourning, in other words, those that are ready to arouse themselves and confront the mighty Leviathan are, in other words, they are cursing themselves because of how terrible and how mighty Leviathan himself is. And thus, what Job is picturing when he uses that phrase is this. He's emphasizing the destructive power that he wants to come, that he wishes would come on the day of his birth. You think of the movies, how they go back in movies and they have time machines and we got to warp back to whenever time or whatever and change the whole sequence of events or whatever. Well, that's basically what Job wanted to do. If we could go back and remove my existence, that's what I want to do. Obliterate it completely. He continues. The day of his birth ought to look like the stars. They ought to be like the stars that look and await the evening in order that they might give off their light. That's what stars do. We don't see the stars during the day, we see them in the darkness. Well, they would be looking to give off their light in the evening, but his desire is that the twilight never comes. And thus, he then says, that in the morning, that would signal their time to stop giving off light in order to set. Now, understanding, we know the earth is a globe and they never set and all these things. Again, figurative language and speeches of how we see things through our eyes. But he then wishes that the morning doesn't even dawn. In other words, these heavenly beings that seem to control the tides and the turning of the days. And he says, these were unable to shut the doors of my mother's womb. They could do all this, but they could not stop me from being born. They could not stop me from being entered into a world in which sorrow would permeate throughout my eyes. And so it's a powerful expression, a description of his despair, and reveals to us a man that is utterly, or feels, I should say, utterly forsaken, utterly lost, no hope, no light in his future. And that sets up the tone for the rest of Job's lament, which he moves from cursing the day of his birth to lamenting his very existence. Number 2, a lament for the time of his existence. Verses 11 down through 19, he says, why died I not from the womb? Why did I not give up the ghost when I came out of the belly? Why did the knees prevent me, or why the breast that I should suck? For now I should have lain still and been quiet, I should have slept, then had I been at rest. With kings and counselors of the earth, who built desolate places for themselves, or with princes that had gold, who filled their houses with silver, or as an untimely or hidden untimely birth I had not been, as infants which never saw light. There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary be at rest. There the prisoners rest together, they hear not the voice of the oppressor. The small and the greater there, and the servant is free from his master. Here again, Job now questions, why didn't I die at birth? Of all the babies that die at birth, of all the babies that never see the day of light, why was I allowed to live? Why could I not have been dead? The imagery he uses of the knees and the breast suggests the care. Why was that care given to me? Why didn't they spare me that, knowing that sorrow could come to me in the future? To Job, life has become a burden. He wonders why he was given the gift of life only to suffer so greatly. The deep existential crisis that Job is grappling with, trying to understand the apparent meaninglessness of his suffering. In these verses, Job imagines, if I had died at birth, I'd finally be at rest. I'd be with all those, the kings and queens. I'd be with the princes, the rich men, the poor men. I'd finally be able to lie down in quiet. I'd finally be able to lie down and rest. In death, all are equal. No one's greater than another, regardless of their status in life. So to Job, death represents an escape from pain, an escape from the suffering that he's now enduring. Again, he compares himself to a stillborn child who never saw the light of day. If only I could have been like one of those infants, then I would not be suffering today. Job's description of death as a place where the wicked cease from troubling and the weary are at rest, they underscore how deeply seated and how deeply desirous he was that peace and rest would come from the pain and turmoil that was destroying him inside. Again, he reflects on the equity at death. Even those who are prisoners in this life, they're no longer subject to the demands of their taskmaster. The small, the great, the slave, the master, all are equal in death. And death, it seems, he says, would be a welcome relief from the injustice of life. Matthew Poole said, Job meddles not here with their eternal state after death, or the sentence and judgment of God against wicked men, of which he speaks hereafter. But here he only speaks of their freedom from worldly troubles, which is the only matter of his complaint in present discourse. In other words, the only thing that matters now, I'm not worried about what happens in the afterlife. I'm not worried about what's happening then. I'm worried about right now, and right now I need peace. Thus, Job moves from lamenting his existence to questioning. Number 3, we see a question on the purpose of life and suffering. A question on the purpose of life and suffering. He says in verse 20, wherefore is light given to him that is in misery? Or why is light given to him that is in misery? And life unto the bitter in soul, which long for death, but it cometh not, and dig for it more than for hid treasures, which rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they can find the grave. Why is light given to a man whose way is hid, and whom God hath hedged in? For my sighing cometh before I eat, and my roarings are poured out like the waters. For the thing which I greatly feared is come upon me, and that which I was afraid of is come unto me. I was not in safety, neither had I rest, neither was I quiet, yet trouble came. Why is life given to those that are going to suffer? Wouldn't it be better off? I mean, we consider the abortion debate, if you will. Well, we know those in innocence die and go to heaven, so isn't there some kind of justice in that they won't have to face this life? They won't have to face this pain? The end justifies the means, in other words. Job's facing rather somewhat of the same dilemma. Life is a burden. Life is a source of pain, not joy. Why live if it's all pain? Why live if it's all going to be a burden? Why not just be dead? He compares the search for death to the search for hidden treasures, suggesting death is something that you should seek after. Death is something you should go hunting for and find it, because that treasure would bring relief. Job's longing for death underscores his belief that life has become unbearable. The pain, the suffering he's enduring, they far outweigh any joy or meaning that life had to offer. Job imagines that those who find the grave would rejoice for finding the relief in death. Again, I know it's all connected and he's revolving around the same topics a lot in these verses, but why is life given to those whose way is hidden? In other words, why is life given to those who feel trapped and forsaken by God? The imagery here of being hedged in suggests Job feels confined. He's in a place he's unable to escape. He sees no way out, no path forward, and this sense of being trapped only darkens and deepens his despair. And thus his questions reflect a deep sense of abandonment. He struggles to understand why God would allow him to suffer so greatly. In verse 24, he says, I'm in a constant state of misery. My sighing, or his sighing, has replaced his daily bread. The sadness of my life, the sighs I make, that's what I live with. I don't eat bread, I sigh. My groanings flow like water. I don't need water, I'll just groan. His suffering is all-consuming. Job's fears and dreads, he says, have now come upon me. that thing which I was afraid of, the thing that nightmare that I envisioned in my mind throughout my life of my children being dead, of everything being taken away from me, of living in turmoil, and the worst possible nightmare I could ever imagine, it's on me now. The sense of dread and fear adds another layer to Job's despair because he feels fearful. Now, the word translated there at the end of verse 26, yet trouble came. It'll confuse us because we understand the current day meaning of the word yet. Today we would say because trouble came, or for trouble came. In other words, I'm not in safety, I have no rest, I was not quiet, because trouble came upon me. And again, this verse is kind of like the capstone on all of it. This is the whole thing. There is no end to my suffering. There is no relief in sight. I'm utterly broken. No hope, no light, never. Why would God give me all those blessings? All those things to enjoy, all those things to have, knowing that the day was going to come when they were all going to be taken away. So those are verses 1 through 26. So what resides there for us? What might you understand? We understand. The Expositor's Bible Commentary said this: even a man of great faith can fall into the slough of despond. That one as great as Job should have such a struggle of faith as a source of support to those similarly affected, especially when viewed in the light of the rest of the book of Job. God prefers we speak with Him honestly, even in our moments of deepest gloom, than that we mouth innocuous cliches far removed from reality. In other words, is it okay to ask why? Absolutely. Most certainly. Now, notice, at no point did Job blame God. At no point was Job shaking his finger at God saying, "Why did you let me live?" No. We're told he did not sin in all this. He's sitting in the darkest, deepest days of his life, tortured mentally and physically. God doesn't desire for us to simply suffer in the deep recesses of our mind. God doesn't want us to compress it all down and keep it all in. No, we're allowed to voice our opinion. We're allowed to talk to God. We're allowed to tell God anything and everything. He continues to wonder, why have I not yet died? At least then there'd be some peace. He closes asking why he had been given everything just to suffer the loss. In other words, wouldn't it have been better? Wouldn't it have been better to not know all those joys than to know them and then face the pain of them being taken away so violently? Like Job, we could come to the same conclusion in our lives. Wouldn't it be better to have never been pregnant than to be pregnant and then lose the child? Wouldn't it be better to never marry than to marry and have to deal with your spouse's infidelity? Wouldn't it be better to struggle to get by in life financially and be dirt poor than to know great riches and then lose it all? Recall last week's example. Job is like the tall willow tree. The tree that towered over the other trees that got hit by the lightning. Well, the tallest tree is the path of least resistance and the one that's most likely to face the onslaught of the lightning. Job, we were told back in chapter 1, verse 1, perfect, upright, feared God, eschewed evil, the holiest man that has ever lived. Most spiritual man alive, and thus we learned, as we considered last week, he was ripe for the picking for Satan's plot, if you will. So wouldn't it be better to stay somewhat immature? Wouldn't it better not to grow in holiness? Wouldn't it be better to be lukewarm, if you will, than to be the holiest, the most mature, the most on fire for God, knowing that if so, I may face the onslaught of the devil, so it'd be better that I stay down here, some might say. That's basically the questions that Job is asking. Those are the questions that we face and deal with today. And in answering those questions, I've got a couple fallacies of what those questions lead us to. So the first fallacy is this: the false dilemma, or the false dichotomy fallacy. In other words, this occurs when a situation is presented having only two alternatives. In other words, I either suffer or I'm holy, or I'm unholy. I can either be the holiest person in the world and suffer greatly for it, or I can be the most unholy person in the world and never have to deal with the sufferings that might come on those holy people. In other words, there's only two options. Well, there's actually many options. Either avoid holiness or avoid suffering is the two positive. This fallacy overlooks the fact that there is possibly other options. In other words, like finding meaning in suffering. Finding that holiness and suffering are not mutually exclusive. In Job's case specifically, recall, again, James 5:11, indeed we count them blessed who endure. You have heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. It wasn't just about suffering. It wasn't just about being unholy. It wasn't just about holiness. No suffering. God had a plan through it all. Now, the second fallacy that we come upon with thinking of this, wouldn't it have been better if this never happened than to have it have happened and faced something else, is the appeal to consequences fallacy. Now, this fallacy involves arguing that something must be true or false based on whether the consequences are desirable or undesirable. The idea that it might be better not to be holy because it leads to suffering could be seen as an appeal to the negative consequences of holiness, rather than evaluating, be ye holy for I am holy. In other words, evaluating holiness on its own merit, evaluating godliness on its own merit and what it brings. Now, the third fallacy is the straw man fallacy, and this is not always present within this circumstance, but it is, in some contexts it could be, and that is this. If someone were to argue that holiness is undesirable because it leads to suffering, then they misrepresent the nature of holiness to make it seem like it only results in suffering. In other words, the holiest people always suffer. Not true. That's making a straw man just to knock it down. It's an oversimplification. It's a distortion of what true holiness is. So those are some of the fallacies that we might face as we go along with those questionings about, wouldn't it have been better if this never happened? That way this never happened? The long and short of it is that we can ask why. We can wonder if it would have been better not to have known, not to have had, not to have loved, not to have joyed, not to have had all these great blessings, in order that we might not have to face the ugly consequences that come in the future. We can ask that question. We can wonder that question. Although I would say this, while it's okay to ask, and while it's okay to wonder, it is not okay to believe it. It's not okay to believe it. Yes, we can count the cost. Yes, we should count the cost. Following God means I'm going to have to become more like God. I can't stay in this immature state. I'm to mature as a Christian. And I got to count the cost. There could be some downfalls in the future. There could be some consequences due to that. There could be suffering that I face, not because God's torturing me, but because the devil's attacking me. All that is possible, and we should count the cost, but we should not allow the potential downfalls that might come to grip us with fear such that we are fearing man, we're fearing the devil, we're fearing consequences and suffering and sadness and depression, but with such fear that we cannot fear God who blesses. In fact, those things we look at as consequences, the downfalls of becoming a holy person like Job, in fact, those might be the very things that actually grow our faith to be more holy, to be more like Christ, to be more in tune with the Godhead. The value of being holy is not diminished because of suffering. Rather, suffering is sometimes a path that leads to even greater holiness toward God. So how do we take Job's lament here in chapter 3? I think we take it this way. We take it as a challenge to consider how we respond to suffering in our own lives. We take it as a challenge to consider how we make sense of all the pain and all the loss and all the suffering and all the hardships that we've encountered in life. How do we do that? While we should certainly seek meaning and understanding, it remains highly important that in the midst of our suffering and loss, we don't make important decisions. That's like grief 101. Don't make any major changes in your life right now. You're not thinking clear. You're not seeing clearly. Dwayne Garrett had this to say. He said, "We should let the process run its course." Job endured much before he attained profound insights into the ways of God. We may not all be as intellectually bold as Job, but if we endure with patience and faith the dark night of the soul, we will emerge with greater wisdom and stronger character. In other words, we will emerge holier. Finally, it's important for us to remember this. This isn't the end of the story. The story doesn't end at verse 26. No, it continues on. In fact, the story we know ends in phenomenal blessing. But to get to chapter 42, to get to the phenomenal blessing, we got to go through all the way through chapters 1, 2, 3, 4 to 41, etc. So, yep, exactly. Right. Exactly. We want to be there, but we got to wait. We got to endure the suffering of this present age. So, next week we will cover chapter 4, verse 1 through chapter 14, verse 22. So, if you're doing homework and doing reading, there's a lot there. This is the longest section of that we're going to cover, and that'll be the first cycle of speeches. So there's basically 3 cycles of speeches between all of these, and we'll cover the first cycle, then the second the next week, and then the third the next week. So that's all for today.